Hello everybody and welcome to this week's Sparta Live. Γεια σας και καλώς ορίσατε στο Sparta Live αυτής της εβδομάδας. Sparta Live is brought to you from the Centre of Spartan and Peloponnesian Studies at the University of Nottingham with the kind support of the municipality of Sparti. I must convey greetings from the Mayor of Sparti, Dr. Petros Loukas, who unfortunately is unable to be with us today due to prior administrative commitments. My name is Lynn Fotheringham. I'm a lecturer here at Nottingham and I have published on the presentation of Sparta in modern popular culture. Before we start the discussion, I'd like to ask my colleague Steve to say a few words about a good friend of the Centre, and could we have the PowerPoint?
Thank you, Lynn. Last week, the world of Spartan studies suffered a great loss with the untimely death of Dr. Anton Powell. Anton has been a towering figure in our field, initiator of the International Sparta Seminar, creator of the Celtic Conference in Classics, and founder of the Classical Press of Wales. Since 1999, Anton's press has published no fewer than 15 books on Spartan history and reception. Anton himself was a polymath who did notable work on both Greece and Rome. But on Sparta alone, he edited at least 10 volumes, including the recent monumental Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Sparta. And he also authored numerous major articles. The astounding renaissance of Spartan history over the last generation would have been impossible without him. Anton was also a great friend of Nottingham. He lived here in the late 1980s, and he purposely chose a house overlooking the Trent Bridge cricket ground from which he could view the field of play. He had a deep love for the city, especially for its rich local culture. He was a frequent visitor to our Centre for Spartan and Peloponnesian Studies, and he gave us and our students much invaluable support. Finally, he was one of my closest academic friends, my long-standing collaborator, and the publisher of many of my works. His death leaves a gaping hole in the personal and academic lives of many people around the world. Farewell, dear colleague, dear friend. We shall not forget you.
Thank you, Steve, for that moving tribute. Anton will be very sorely missed. Next slide, please. In today's session, we're looking at a graphic novel, 3, which focuses on the Helots, or Helots, Sparta's slave or serf class. Our guests are the writer, Kieran Gillen, my colleague Steve Hodkinson, who acted as historical consultant, and the book's Greek publisher, Lefteris Stavrianos of Gemma Press. I should say at the start that while we've avoided the most violent images from the book today, there is a lot of violence in 3, just in case you still associate comics with kids. 3 is set in 364 BC, over a century after Thermopylae and 40 years after the end of the Peloponnesian War. Next slide, please. Specifically, the story is set after a less widely known event, Sparta's defeat by Thebes at the Battle of Leuctra. After this, the Spartans were forced to free the Helots in the territory of Mycenae. In this extract, a Helot named Terpander, still enslaved because he is in Laconia, not Mycenae, taunts a group of Spartiates about this, with predictably disastrous consequences. Next slide, please. And the next one, thank you. The three helots of the title, Terpander, Damar and Claros, survive the massacre of their homestead, killing some of their attackers, and they flee for free Messene. They are pursued by one of Sparta's two kings, Cleomenes, much against his will, but under compulsion from the city's magistrates, the ephors. Cleomenes is accompanied by his traditional honour guard of 300 men, not selected in the same way as those who died at Thermopylae, by the way. They are also pursued by young Spartiate Arimnestos, who has been punished for running away from the massacre. We will be talking later about his mother, Girtias. And there's one more character we hope to discuss, who is neither Helot nor Spartiate, and we'll introduce him if there's time. The three runaways end up trapped in a mountain cave. And I won't spoil what comes next for you, because this has already got me to the key point. Next slide, please. This is a reverse Thermopylae. Instead of 300 Spartans fighting for Greek freedom, being trapped by what Herodotus says were millions of Persians, the same number are trapping three helots, deprived of their freedom by the Spartans themselves. Kieran has talked openly about his relationship with Frank Miller's 300. Simultaneous admiration for the graphic storytelling, a couple of examples here, and annoyance at the omission of the Spartans' brutal treatment of their enslaved class. This led to his inspiration for 3. You can find some of his interviews discussing this using the Google search suggestions on the slide. Now, 300 is a gripping and polished reimagining of this old story about heroic patriots. But Thermopylae is only one of the stories that can be told about Sparta, and it's a story that has been told many times before. We don't have time for my full survey of Greek history and comics, but here's a very quick taster, focusing, of course, on Sparta. Next slide, please. Although comics publishing in English has diversified enormously in the last decades, into memoirs, journalism, literary adaptation, instructional comics, contemporary fiction, and many other genres, historical fiction and instructional history, especially pre-20th century, remain rare. French language comics have always been more diverse, and historical fiction exists, but very little that's set in Greece. Greek mythology, by the way, is a completely different matter. There's plenty of that. There are educational and humorous comics covering Greek history, and here are 2 examples. War stories are dominant. Next slide, please. The first examples on this slide are probably still educational or children's comics. Thermopylae features a lot. It's even included in the European Classics illustrated book entitled The Battle of Salamis. Only the Greeks in Classica Iconographimena produced 1 book for each battle. In an entirely different category, I want to draw the attention of comics fans and ancient historians alike to the final story of Westerheld and Breccia's Mort Cinder, which is set at Thermopylae and is now at long last available in English. The line work is just amazing. Next slide, please. 2 French historical fiction series cover different periods in Greek history. Sparte is set in the reign of Nabis during Sparta's final resistance against Rome, and it does include more than just warfare. Keltos starts in Greek Massalia and includes the Celtic invasion of Greece and one of the other battles of Thermopylae. Next slide, please. And finally, I have to give a shout out to a recent work published simultaneously in Greek and English by Alekos Papadatos and Avram Kawa, Democracy. A, because it's superb, B, because it is about something other than war, and C, because of the brilliant cameo appearance of the Spartans. Democracy presents historically attested events from a fictional character's point of view. Next slide, please. 3 tells a fictional story in a thoroughly researched historical setting. You can narrate historical events from a Helot perspective, but Kieran wanted to tell a story as heroic as Thermopylae about the people in Sparta who never made it to the history books. In my article on 3, I argue that he does justice to the Helots not only by acknowledging their existence and showing some of what they are said to have suffered, but also by giving them personality and agency, refusing to treat them simply as abject victims. He also avoids the trap of caricaturing the Spartans as villainous oppressors and nothing else, which would oversimplify the lived reality of both groups. Next slide, please. In a conversation with Steve printed at the back of the book, he says, "If I was entirely honest, initially my inspiration did lean angry. However, the second I started the research, I couldn't just stick a dagger into Sparta. I wanted to show Sparta with all its complications." We won't be able to cover all of those complications in this session, but let's see how much we can manage. Next slide, please. We start with the prologue introducing us to the Helots. By the way, we've split the pages into 2 so that they fit onto the screen better. In what could be an idyllic country scene, the Helots are harvesting olives, but are watched by sinister-looking youths with ritual face paint. Next slide, please. Identified as the Crypteia, the sons of the masters, the sons of the free. In the following pages, these young Spartiates will attack and kill one of the Helot men. This is based on ancient sources. Next slide, please. Plato describes the Crypteia only as a training in hardihood, involving going without shoes or blankets in winter. But Plutarch tells us that young Spartiates were sent out to kill Helots as a terror tactic to keep the other Helots cowed. For a scholar, it's difficult to decide whether one or the other of these 2 sources, or an amalgam of the 2, gives the most accurate picture. And remember, neither of these sources were from Sparta. I'd like to invite Kieran to talk about how he handled the uncertainties over what the Crypteia really was. And we probably want to go back a slide.
As Lynn so helpfully noted, the initial actual inspiration for Free did lean angry. And I think some of that most creeps in because before actually starting my proper research into Free, I had my very few things I quote unquote knew about Sparta. And it was very much the Crypteia was one of them. It was the Wetsec, don't they hunt, how can this be this bastion of freedom? So this opening scene where this Crypteia, who seemingly utterly without reason murder some of their slave class, is this portrait of Sparta at its worst. I wanted to kind of like open this sort of statement of what they're very much worst idea about Sparta before branching into complexities, the wake-up call, if you will. And this, of course, meant trying to synthesize those 2 sources, because this is what a major part of Free was. There's so little we know about the Spartans in many ways from very different angles. How can we actually take what there is? So for me, obviously the idea of them as a sort of police class, the idea that this is a warring upon their own people for terror reasons was important for that. But at the same time, I couldn't just do that. It was like we also have this other source. So with the Crypteia, we try to, by fiction, merge them. We present the Crypteia here as naked, and we do that naked because as if it was sports. The idea that this is something, them actually doing this in the field as a naked thing would be more like the sports. So these are just little nods to show that we're trying to do that, while at the same time drilling down into one very specific sort of perspective. It's simultaneously a rite of passage and also a kind of police state. Steve, I think there was something else about the scene you wanted to highlight, yes?
Yes, thank you, Kieran. Could we move on 2 slides, please? Okay, I want to say a few words that might be of interest to those of you who are fascinated by the interaction of author and academic. I think we've got a bit missing from this first slide. There should be a bit in the bottom right corner.
I think it's an animation. Try clicking again.
Okay, so we have in the top right the scene without lettering that we saw earlier on, and on the left hand side we have Kieran's script that he sent me for scrutiny. So the ordinary text gives the sort of scene, and then the captions are in capitals, and he's summarising the status of the helots: not slaves, beneath slaves. Slaves are owned by men, and in the crucial bits I want to point out, the helots are owned by the state, and then they are slaves to their country. And here I pointed out in my comments that this is a controversial topic, that he's been expressing the older view of helots as owned by the state, but the recent research was suggesting that they were the private property of the Spartiate masters, although subject to a high degree of state control. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. And here we have Kieran's reply on the right. He was aware of the debate, but went for the more traditional line. He wasn't sure whether he could move easily to the newer view, partly because it's a complex issue, and partly because, as he put it, the owned by the stateness has a certain poetry in terms of three central metaphor. They're all owned by the state, helots and Spartans both. But he says, when I do my final polish, I'll see if I can give a tweak. Could you animate a bit further, Matt, to get the bottom left? And on the left-hand side, now we see the final comic in the top left, and then in the bottom left we can see the changes that Kieran has made in response to my comments. So the bits in blue text are the bits that was the original text. So the 2.2, the helots are owned by the state, and I put in red text that how it's been changed has been changed to the helots also bear the state's fetters. And then 2.3, they are slaves to their country, is changed to they serve all in their country. So Kieran has made some adjustments to reflect the current thinking about helot status, while retaining the overall theme that he wanted to achieve. So I think I'll hand back to you, Lynn, at this point.
Okay. Before we leave the helots, I would like to ask Lefteris a question. Lefteri, was the focus on the helots one of the reasons why you wanted to publish 3 in Greece?
Hello, Lynn. Hello, everybody. Yes, it was actually it was what attracted me the most, because as Greeks we are used to read stories that the heroes are the Spartans, specifically the Spartan warrior. So in this story, the heroes are the slaves, which is very intriguing, and also gives a different perspective from what we are used to, the perspective of the warrior, of the mythical Spartan warrior, which is quite often adopted by the far right and the ultra-nationalists. There are people here in Greece that sometimes they feel embarrassed to admit that to admit their enthusiasm for Greek history, and that is a shame, because you know, we can't abandon our history. And we shouldn't abandon it.
That's very interesting to hear, and I agree absolutely. It's interesting to us to hear that the Greeks don't know more about the helots, because we might think that everybody in Greece knows everything about Greek history. So it's wonderful that the different perspective of 3 is interesting to you in Greece as well as to us here. Okay, thank you, Lefteris. Let's move on. Next slide, please. The next page we're looking at shows us the young Spartiate Arimnestos with his mother Gyrtias, after he has been punished for fleeing from the Helots. Kieran cleverly uses this short scene to fit in some important detail about Sparta in the 360s. Kieran, why was it important to you to include this character?
I mean, very much as in the process of falling in love with the research, is like you kind of discover so much and just want to sort of share it. And then much part of the actual process of Free is it's the story set up basically 100 years after Thermopylae. The idea of, okay, this famous, this leads to Plataea, this is a century that Sparta eventually dominates, and then it all comes crashing down. Where does being Spartan get you? And that's kind of all the way through Free as a theme in terms of like this sort of the very awkward how this culture has been fetishized by people inaccurately, doesn't really ever deal with the fact of what it actually did to Sparta. And of course, this is really interesting because one of the many things if people don't know about, and Spartan women are also very interesting in that area as well. If I mentioned earlier about there's three things people know about Sparta. If there's the Thermopylae aspect, there's if you know about the Crypteia, that's probably the second bit, and then the Spartan women, and it's the idea of like how Spartan women had a very different sort of role in the society, it seemed. I mean, and I wanted to sort of highlight a lot of that, and especially here it's about inheritance. Is that Sparta at the start of this period was it about 8,000? Like it was, a sizable population. Before the Battle of Creta, they're down to about 1,200 Spartiates. And afterwards you're sub 1,000. This is an enormous population decline for people who define citizenship like that. At least part of this is part of what Gyrtias is talking about, is about the estates having to be split. And of course, to be to be a Spartan, you have to have a certain amount of fiscal wealth. And so in other words, there is a pressure against having more children, because if you split your estates too much, you can't afford for them to be Spartans. And of course, if you don't have enough new Spartans, you can't carry on running Sparta. So this kind of was just one of those interesting population demographics, I guess, which of course is the fact I've said the phrase population demographics says a lot about Free, I suspect. Steve, could you tell me a bit more about actually the sources as well and your own research into Spartan women?
Okay, yes, thank you, Kieran. Well, my work on Spartan women has been looking at their greater than normal property rights and their use of wealth. But I'm not taking the simplistic line of how liberated Spartan women were. Yes, I do want to show how some women were empowered by their wealth, but also how they were often also constrained by it. For example, because girls could inherit land and wealth, their families often controlled their marriages, using them to create advantageous marriage alliances. And in the panel in front of us, we see Gyrtias, a mature, wealthy married woman. But in the top right panel, we see how the Spartan property system had constrained her life choices. Her only son had been disgraced as a coward, and she complains, "Our only heir, if we'd had another, it would not be such a tragedy, but that would have split the estates." And as Kieran alluded to, had Gyrtias had a second son, their lands would have been divided between the two sons. Each would only be half as wealthy as their parents. So she and her husband had felt constrained to have only one child. But now, no one, or at least no one of consequence, would marry their daughter to her cowardly son. Their line is likely to die out or to die into obscurity, so she wishes that she had a daughter. And if we could move on to the next slide. Thank you. Here she takes solace in her fine horses, which she's been training for the Olympic 4-horse chariot race. And note that the year 364, in which the novel set, was an Olympic game year. And these panels, I think I like them because they capture a nice balance between the traditional idea of a Spartan mother's scorn for her cowardly son and the idea in more recent research of her desire for personal glory through owning a victorious chariot team And here I should say that she's following in the footsteps of many wealthy Spartan men who'd been entering their teams for the Olympic Games and having a long string of victories, a thing requiring great wealth. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And if we just animate a bit further, and there's just one more bit to animate too at the very bottom. Lovely, thank you. This is the slide showing that Girtias is actually based upon a real Spartan woman, Kiniska, who won the Olympic 4-horse chariot race in 396 and 392 BC. And we have here the fragmentary remains of the base of her grandiose monument, which had 8 bronze statues on it, including her own personal statue. And you can see from the text, which is inscribed along the top of the base, she boasts of her fathers and brothers being kings of Sparta. She goes on to boast of her chariot of quick-footed horses and their conquering. And then she climaxes by saying, "I declare myself the only woman in all Greece to have gained this crown." And then if you look on the base, you might see a little bit of writing on the front of the base facing us, and that's the text in the bottom left-hand corner, "Apelles of Megara made me," a famous early 4th century sculptor. Not a Spartan, a foreigner. Kiniska must have expended great wealth, probably in bullion or coin, to pay this famous sculptor to make this monument for her. And I think that's, I could talk a lot more about this, but I better move on now. Are we going back to you, Lynn?
Yes, thank you, Steve. So if we can have the next slide, please. The last page we wanted to look at introduces that other character I mentioned earlier. The caption tells us that he is Skirites, and Aramnestos' dialogue in the next panels indicate that he is a scout, a guide, and a tracker. Next slide, please. Subsequent dialogue gives us a bit more information, and now I'm looking at the Skirites' own dialogue in the second panel. Even when the Skiritai were your subjects tells us that there are people called Skiritai who are hanging around in Sparta. They were once subjects of Sparta, but not anymore. And then, "Do not ever mistake me for a Helot," confirms that there are other groups of people around besides Helots and Spartiates. Steve, could you tell us a bit more about the Skiritai?
Yes, Lynn.
Steve's camera is not you're not on camera, Steve. You are now.
Thank you. Yes, the Skiritai came from the region of Skiritis to the north of Sparta. They were a free people, and although they had obligations to support Sparta, they had certain privileges. Their soldiers fought as a separate unit within the Lacedaemonian army, typically on the left wing. They were also the only group to lead in front of a Spartan king when the army was on the march. Therefore, they also acted as advanced scouts, which is what Nestos wants Aristodemos to do for him. But the key point, as Lynn indicated, is that by the year in which 3 is set, 364 BC, their region was no longer under Spartan control. Now, Kieran actually hadn't realised this in his initial draft of the text, so his heading for the first of the 2 pages that Lynn showed us was Highland Skirites, subject of Sparta. And then in the panel that Lynn described a bit later, Aristodemos says, "You can't order me, we serve you in battle, but march before your king." So this was written as if the Skiritai were still subject to Sparta. And when I initially critiqued Kieran's draft text, I myself missed the important point that by 364 that they'd been freed from subjection to Spartan control. And this mistake dawned on me only much later, and I had to send Kieran a frantic email hoping that it wasn't too late to put our mistake right. Luckily it wasn't, and Kieran changed those 2 bits of text. And Kieran tells me that this is quite normal in when he's writing in historical periods. So let me hand over to Kieran to say a bit more about what attracted him to this character.
Yes, I would say it's not actually historical fiction unless there's a last-minute panic on print deadline due to some really fundamental thing that's mistaken. What it was the case, like any historical fiction, or any fiction involving a large organisation, always ends up having to simplify. Like if you do something in the civil service, normally there's so many people involved in the decision, and for the sake of fiction, you get down to a couple. In the same way, we're trying to model Spartan society, and like. Okay, we can explain Helots, we can explain Spartans, who are two very distinct groups. People probably won't be familiar with how they fundamentally work. That's a lot for people to worry about. At the same time, it doesn't really describe what Sparta was like. In that, there was a lot of free Laconians, and there is I can't even pronounce Neoptonius. There is Helots who were freed and then put in a garrison sort of position. For example, there's always other. Thank you very much. So there's basically this much more complicated idea of how a society actually worked. And whilst I couldn't include that in depth, what I wanted to do was include somebody who represented that by showing somebody from someone else in Sparta who's clearly got a position outside the Helots and the Spartans. So outside of that dichotomy, that implies there is another possibility. And that was very much quite important. And especially because he was also slightly falling in love with the research in terms of like, oh, these are interesting. These kind of like sort of mountainous, so that could be kind of tracky. As in, they had a real like the weight of like, oh, that's interesting. I would like to include that if I can. But really, it was about that kind of, let's really show why what Sparta could be like and hint at the expanse of it. And I think that wraps them up actually. Back to you, Lynn.
Yeah, he's a perfect fit for the role that you required in this at this point in the story, for the part that he plays later on as well. I think we have time for a supplementary question. It seems from what you're saying, Kieran, that you didn't only read the ancient sources, you also read secondary literature. Is that correct?
It is. It's sort of like there is it's one of those sort of things about when you're reading the Helots specifically. It's like reading the modern sources is like there's so many little gaps that you need to actually try to find. And within Helots, you've got to kind of go to quite generally contemporary academic stuff to get people theorizing what the Helots are at all. And this is kind of course, it makes the irony of the project in that you were forced to do this because you wanted to do a story about people who didn't get stories. And of course, that they didn't get stories means we know very little about them. I suppose the interesting thing that doing the comic in some way felt like in dialogue with research in terms of ideas were presented in there, and then I folded them in, and then often it was a question of like logically trying to build the Helots' life in terms of like Spartans are, they mainly live in Sparta in these kind of things, and the Sparta is big, so there'll be Helots who are in farmsteads distantly with little exposure to Spartans on a day-to-day basis, was my thinking. So, and then, for example, one of the things we know is they've got to wear a hat all the time. They meant this dog hair's cap, and I was sort of thinking, would you actually wear that if your Spartan wasn't around? You know what I mean? So it's that kind of the dialogue with ideas, which were then presented, sort of made it feel very alive for me, I guess.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And we all in turn enjoy very much all the things that you've squeezed in. And I'll just say to the audience, for anyone who hasn't yet seen the book, there's a lot of back matter. There's a lot of information at the back of the book about Kieran's process, about the relationship with the sources and all that. So if anybody's interested in that aspect of how the comic came into being, the book can tell us that as well. Can we have the next slide, please? Before we close the PowerPoint, I want to invite members of the audience to contribute to my own audience research. I'd like to hear from anyone who has read 3. Whether you are new to comics or a fan, whether you are new to Greek history or a fan. You can participate by filling in a questionnaire, by joining in a focus group, or by taking part in our Twitter reading group in July. The questionnaires are online already, but for everything else, there's a bit of time for those of you who haven't yet read the book to do so. You'll find the link to this web page, which gives all the details, at the top of the questions chat for the meeting. Plus, I'll be tweeting it regularly from @UONClassics. So if we can close the PowerPoint, please, and I just have a final question for each of our speakers before we move open to the audience. So Steve first. What did you get out of the project, Steve? And did it change your perspective on Sparta and the Helots in any way?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Lynn. I think I'd say two things. First of all, the process of having to visualize Sparta added a lot to my thinking about what life was like. I mean, for example, Kieran was trying to convey to Ryan Kelly how to portray a Helot farm. We have very little evidence, but it set me really thinking quite hard about, in what kind of dwellings would the Helots have actually lived. And then the second thing I'd say is that it fed into work that I've been doing about Sparta and war. Some members of the audience will know that I've been trying to argue that Sparta was not as militarized a state as it's often commonly portrayed. One of the key arguments in favour of those who do believe that Sparta was a militarized state is the argument that because they had this massive Helot slave population, the Spartans had to organise themselves militarily for their personal security. And I've been arguing that this isn't the case, and that in fact the Spartans went about their everyday lives unarmed, because the Helots were an occasional rather than a constant problem for them. But it's important for this not to slip over to the idea that the Helots had an easy life. And I think working on 3 reinforced my idea that although on the face of it, on the surface, much of Helot life must have gone on without a Spartiate presence there, that there was always the threat, as happens in the first issue of 3, that the Spartans might suddenly intrude violently against any particular group of Helots, and that therefore there's an underlying terror and fear and brutality within the Spartan system, even though it doesn't necessarily involve the Spartans themselves living a militarized lifestyle.
Thank you, Steve. My final question for Lefteris is in relation to what you've told me about you reducing the number of works that you've translated from English into Greek in recent years, because many Greek comics fans are perfectly happy to read the original language. Why did you make an exception for 3?
Well, firstly, because it is written by Kieran Gillen. Okay. I'm a big fan of his work, and also because of the subject. I think that it's a very good opportunity to have a breakthrough to the medium. I mean, because of the subject, it could reach more people. It would be taken more seriously.
So you think that other people besides comics fans will read this because of the subject matter?
Yes, of course. And the advantage here is that it has a correct historical setting. It's not like we see a mockery or like something that may be entertaining but without a correct historical background.
Mostly made up. So
yeah.
Are there many comics dealing with history published in Greece these days?
Well, I think that yes, the last 5 to 6 years, there are a lot of people, a lot of publishers that are interested in history, either modern or ancient. And also Gemma Press, the last 5 years, we have done like 4 books that is mostly based on history.
That's great. So it's interesting to hear that the comics world in Greece, like the comics world in the English-speaking world, is diversifying in subject matter. Okay, finally, the last question for Kieran. Do you think you will ever come back to ancient Sparta in your writing?
Oh, it's like I would hope so. I have one story idea that it sort of nags at me. But when I was rereading Free and going for the notes, I was sort of struck by all those other things I sort of nod at in terms of, oh, that's an interesting random historical period, you know. But the one thing that feels like a major area of Sparta that I didn't really cover, and we sort of talked about it a little here, is that something's a little bit more centered on Spartan women. In the of the three main characters, Damar's probably the character I'm least pleased with in the book. At the same time, Girtius is such a showstopper when she arrives. You know, as she just arrived as this amazing, like, utterly monstrous, like, very compelling character. And it's like, oh yeah, I would follow this woman. So the idea of doing something more in the Spartan home life, as in that kind of like, almost like, I love to do a Spartan story that's solely about the home life. You never see a battle. And it's always about, like, it's almost like how Jane Austen was all set around the Napoleonic Wars, but you never actually got to the front lines. It's all about that sort of part of the life. And doing something like that with Sparta would be very appealing.
I hope you get to do it one day, but I know that you have many, many other projects on the go. So I think we should now open it up to the audience, and I will hand over to Matt as usual to let us know what kind of questions we're getting.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you to all of our speakers this week. We've had plenty of questions coming in as ever. Apologies if I don't quite get to yours. So the first one, the most popular so far, reaches back to last week, where Stephen Pressfield said that he avoided the topic of homosexuality in Sparta because he feared that it would dominate the public discussion of his book and kind of obscure the themes that he wanted to stress. Whereas in contrast, you're very upfront about the intimate relationship between Tyrtaeus and Cleomenes. So perhaps, Kieran, you could tell us about why you made that choice and whether that theme has dominated public discussion as far as you're aware of it.
Perhaps not. To me, it's like, I would not say that. I think the most controversial aspect of Free was the fact we did painted statues, which appeared to confuse almost all the reviewers, and they got quite huffy about it. Whilst I think it's one situation, if you're reading a historical thing about Sparta and you know enough about the history, you know it was there. It's not like obscure history in some ways. I mean, perhaps the only thing which we drilled down into was actually trying to make it as precise as possible based upon the research we know, in terms of, like, in Sparta, this is predominantly thought about in terms of the institutionalized sort of relationships. It's younger men before marriage and younger boys in that way. And that was kind of the relationship I was interested in talking about, because it's what the text and what the world says. At least part of it, of course, is, also I do say that, at least part of the project is counteracting the Spartan mirage. And if the idea is being presented that the hyper-heterosexualized version of Sparta, that's definitely like, well, no, let's genuinely show you what Sparta is like and be aware, you know, this is the culture here. So no, it did not prove controversial, but that might also be about my readership as well, in that my readership is quite, what's the word? Probably open to very queer texts in a way which maybe like the more general readership isn't.
Thank you, that's excellent. Just picking up on something you touched on a little bit there. Somebody's asked, what do you feel we gain in accessing the past through graphic novels that maybe we don't through other mediums?
What do we gain? I mean, all mediums kind of have different strengths and weaknesses. It's that kind of like what specifically with comics is, there's a sense of place, as in like you can do, as in you can also see things. That's very much key. That's key. There's elements like there's no real budgetary constraints. So I can do. I mean, for example, in another series I actually did a full Roman triumph, and I did that solely through somebody being incredibly brave and wanting to do a Roman triumph and drawing it. Whilst, of course, doing that in a book doesn't really capture the effect of a Roman triumph, and doing that in a film costs all the money in the world. So there's a power and accessibility there. And I think one of the big advantages of comics is because of the money, in that they are a cheap medium to produce, relatively speaking. So you can get a greater intensity of idea there. the idea that I didn't need to go and get an extremely large budget to try to do this incredibly, as accurate as I could make it, story about Sparta. I just I did it, and then that can be out as a purer statement about me and Ryan's artistic vision, if that makes sense. But to us, I would say like all mediums have strengths and weaknesses.
I wonder if Lefteris or Steve have anything they'd like to add to the question of graphic novels as a medium for.
Okay, I'll just say a very quick word. To me, and I should say that I used to read comics as a boy into my early teens, but then before I worked on 3, I'd not seriously read a comic for the best part of 40 years. And what I found was fascinating was that a comic kind of slows the argument down. When you're making a presentation, you've got just a few words and you've got lots of images, and so you can sort of take the sort of points, the historical point being made or being asserted step by step, panel by panel. And I found that's a very powerful way that we could perhaps incorporate into our teaching, but it's certainly a very different way of presenting historical information.
Thank you very much. So another question now that's shot up the opinion polls, as it were. Could you tell us a little bit more about your decision to include a Spartan trembler as a character? What was it that attracted you to this part of Spartan society?
It's one of the things like the idea that there's 2 sides to that. At least part of it is actually the Spartan system. So the idea being, okay, if Spartans were incredibly brave, why were they incredibly brave? You know, if you accept that part of the Mirage, what are the societal devices that lead that to be? And the concept of the Trembler, the idea that they treat people who run from battle very harshly, in essentially there's the shaving off the beard, there's the patched cloak, there's the whole removal from society essentially, and it's so shameful that suicide is quite likely, and all these other things. But there was a specific irony of the period. This is after this unprecedented historical loss for them that was essentially the end of Spartan power. You know, fully 1/3 of the remaining Spartan men were Tremblers. And essentially what happens is they are forgiven, because what else are you going to do? So the utter hypocrisy of somebody else then being treated as the Trembler in the small sense. And, you know, in the case of the story, this guy had a reason, to be honest. Was the utter hypocrisy of that part of the system and how someone might choose to rebel against it. That really appealed to me. I mean, for me, the key part of the story was how this system hurts all these people in it. It doesn't hurt them all equally, but they're all fundamentally victims of this this Spartan quote unquote utopia. So that's very much why I wanted to show that. And this comes to the speaking to not doing the Spartans as pure villains.
Wonderful, thank you. In terms of not having the Spartans be pure villains, somebody's asked if there is a danger that in depicting Spartans as possibly depicting Sparta as somehow unique in the mistreatment of slaves. Was there a consideration of sort of putting this into the wider context of the Greek world at that time, or did you want to focus in on the Helots because they are so unspoken of in relation to the regular Spartan citizens, if you like?
In short, I think that's a really good question. I mean, it's this sort of thing that I imagine Steve would have something to say as well about, in terms of like how different are Helots to other slaves is like one of these very controversial areas of the literature, I think. But specifically, that Helots are painted out of the portrait, and that Helots are specific, and the fact that the Spartan Mirage often involves removing the Helots from the system seem to be worth highlighting them, especially because this is a story, and how Sparta is being specifically used means that it's important to highlight. I mean, even if you accept the Spartan Mirage, which of course I don't, you have to understand the reason why these Spartans were quote unquote so great warriors was because they, had 9 people doing all the work for them. It's not like they magically got a sword. So it's the kind of like the larger picture seemed important to actually focus in on when so many people talk about the upsides of the system.
Steve, would you like to add anything to that, or shall I move along?
I'll just say a very brief word. I think it would have been very difficult for Kieran to start embracing or touching on slavery in other Greek cities. I was very conscious when I was making my critique of his draft text that he had a very challenging task to package a lot of historical information into an audience that doesn't necessarily know much in advance about Sparta.